Hey y'all, this is Brown at IF Brown, and today we're going to be talking about Christine, the special edition on DVD. Christine came out in 1983 and it was directed by John Carpenter, and it was based on the Stephen King novel of the same name. And so the novel and the movie are two very different beasts, but they're both very worthwhile. So if you like Stephen King and you like to read, definitely check out the novel. And if you like, horror movies, definitely check out Christine. So the DVD came out in 2004, which is when I was a senior in high school. So watching this movie for the purposes of doing this review was kind of a walk down memory lane, because this isn't the first time I've seen this movie. I've come back to it more than once over the years, and it's certainly not the first time I've watched the DVD either. But seeing as how the movie itself focuses on a group of characters who are in high school, even though it's in a different decade, and then you have the DVD being released when I was in high school, yeah, double dose of memory lane and a bit of deja vu, because another John Carpenter movie I watched and reviewed was the special edition of The Fog on DVD, in which that particular release was put out when I was in high school as well. So thank you, John Carpenter. But the movie is something that I'm not going to say is a John Carpenter masterpiece, like, say, Halloween, Escape from New York, or The Thing, but it is a good movie, though, and I would argue it's one of John Carpenter's more accessible ones as well, because even though it is a horror movie focusing on a killer car, there's a very relatable human element to it that definitely makes it stand out and elevates it above, say, the cheesy B movie it could have been, and into an actual good movie. And so, I mean, with John Carpenter at the helm, back when he was in his prime, I mean, you weren't going to get a bad movie. So even though, say, there was a potential for a cheesy B movie, it wouldn't be a cheesy B movie. It was going to be a good movie, even if it involved a killer car. So there you go. And I would argue that of the killer car movies I've seen, Christine is still the best. So, but let's go ahead and get into it. So Christine starts off in 1957, and the car, Christine, is a Plymouth Fury, which was being assembled for the year 1958, and she's coming off the assembly line, and right off the bat, something's wrong with her. Workers are injured when they work on her, and at least one worker is, killed under mysterious circumstances when he, decides to take a smoke break in the car. But, yeah, so fast forward to 1978, and we're introduced to the characters of Arnie and Dennis, who are lifelong friends who are starting their, first day as seniors in high school. But Arnie is a rather socially inept nerd. I mean, very intelligent, but can't make it with ladies, and is oftentimes bullied, and so there's an inferiority complex going on for sure because of all this. Whereas Dennis is a popular high school jock, but he is notably not a jerk jock. Like, he's actually a decent guy, and oftentimes goes to bat for Arnie, and tries to do his best to look out for him and keep him from being bullied as much as he can. But he is only one person, and high school's high school, so unfortunately. But Arnie, though, lives rather under a rather domineering set of parents, especially his mother. And so he's got crap he's got to deal with at high school, and he's got crap he's got to deal with at home. And so to make things worse, on their first day as seniors, they end up running afoul of a gang of bullies led by a guy named Buddy Repperton, who is fond of taking switchblades with him to high school. And in fact, on their first day, Buddy and his gang are harassing Arnie in shop class. And so Dennis, steps in and tries to stand up for Arnie, but ends up in a fight with Buddy. And him being outnumbered, he tries to he puts up a good fight, but he gets his ass kicked. And which at that point, the teacher walks in and and sends Buddy and his gang to the office, which draws their ire, and they swear to take their revenge on Arnie specifically, even though Dennis is the one who stepped in and physically try to prevent him from harassing Arnie further. So later that day, Dennis and Arnie are driving back home in Dennis's car, because unfortunately Arnie doesn't drive, and his parents are kind of preventing him from having a car, even though he lives in their home as well. But so he's had to rely on Dennis to get from point A to point B. And on their way to Arnie's house, Arnie starts to say, whoa, hey Dennis, whoa, hey, pull over. And they're in a bit of a rural area of town, and Dennis is like, whoa, what's going on? And so there's this house that has all this junk outside of it, and there's this rusted red car. It's a Plymouth Fury, and it's Christine. And so they come out to check her out, and Dennis is like, dude, Arnie, this thing is junked. I mean, why are you so worked up about it? But Arnie's like, oh, she could be fixed. And he's wanting to see if she works, which is when the owner of the car comes out, a guy named Leigh, who is this old guy. He's got a brace and everything, and he tosses Arnie the keys, and he's like, hey, start her up. And so Arnie starts the car, and believe it or not, it still runs. I mean, even though the mileage is out the door, it still runs. And so Arnie's like, how much do you want for the car? And Dennis is like, dude, Arnie, what the hell are you doing? And the old guy's like, I'll take $300 for it. And he says, one condition is you can't return it though, because I'm selling the place and I'm moving out of town. And so Dennis is trying to talk Arnie out of it. He's like, dude, I mean, $300 for this thing? I mean, this car's a piece of crap, Arnie. I mean, we can get you a better car. I mean, come on, let's talk about it. But Arnie's like, no, I'm taking her. And so the old guy's like, hey, I'll drop the paperwork. And and so then Dennis takes the old man aside. He's like, hey, look, dude, Arnie, I mean, he's just a dumb kid, man. I mean, come on, cut him a break, will you? And so the old guy's all like, well, you don't know your friend as well as you think you do, shitter. And Dennis is like, wait, what? But then, of course, I mean, Arnie goes ahead and gets the car, and they drive back to Arnie's house. And instead of his parents, being, excited at the fact that, their son has a car now, they're both, more than a little pissed off. One, because he got a car without, their permission, because apparently they do everything as a committee, as a family. I mean, family. And on the other hand, the car is literally a piece of junk. And Dennis is trying to explain. It's like, hey, look, I tried to talk him out of it, but he's, I mean, he's his own person. He can do what he wants as far as buying stuff goes. I mean, that's his deal. And so, at that point, he tries to leave, and Arnie is trying to talk with his parents and say, look, just let me keep it at the garage, and let me keep it here, and so that way I can actually have a place to maintain it and what have you. But his mom, who wears the pants in the family, is telling him, no, you can't. You will not, as long as you have this car here, it will not be on on this property. And so Arnie's like, okay, fine, I'll take it to Darnell's, who, Darnell is a guy who runs this, auto, mechanic in the garage. And usually, it's got a junkyard, full of, parts that people can salvage for scrap and everything. And so Dennis and, Arnie, they head over to Darnell's, and, once they get in, Darnell, who's this really grouchy, cigar chomper of a guy, is, he's telling Dennis, he's like, I knew a guy who had a car like that once. really mean son of a bitch too. But as soon as Arnie steps out of the car, Darnell launches in on him, telling him that you're on probation, punk. You're you screw around with me, blah blah blah. He's basically treating Arnie like shit, just because he can. And Dennis tries to take up for him, but he's all like, "You trying to talk your friend out of a place here?" And so he's like, "No." And so Darnell lets Arnie keep the car there, but basically tells him he's on probation, and he's not going to get any sort of free ride or anything like that. And going from there, things start to transpire in Arnie's life, because as time goes on, he's gotten to where he's able to work in Darnell's garage and work to repair Christine, and she's actually starting to look better. And Christine, of course, I mean, it's a name that the the old guy that they bought the car from gave her. And so she literally has the name Christine, and Arnie starts calling her that. And of course, some of the people are noticing that, wow, this car's coming along pretty well. But Arnie starts to change in terms of personality. Like, he starts to, in some ways, become more confident and a little more, say, defiant in terms of, say, how he interacts with those around him. And one of the other things that happens is he strikes up a relationship with a beautiful newcomer to a school named Leigh, who transferred in from another place, but she had a really high set of test scores, and so both she and Arnie are bright when it comes to the brains department, except she just happens to be drop dead gorgeous. But the two of them end up striking up a relationship, arguably due in part to Arnie's newfound confidence, which definitely catches a lot of people off guard, including Dennis. And so, but unfortunately for Dennis, though, he ends up suffering a rather bad injury during a football game, to a point where if it had been any lower, or if it had been a degree one way or another than it was, he would have been paralyzed from the waist down, so he's not going to be able to play football again. And so he's witnessing Arnie, though. Arnie comes to visit him and check in on him from time to time, but he notices that Arnie's definitely changed. And on one hand, he's happy that Arnie's got a girlfriend now, but he is sort of put off by how caustic Arnie's become. And when it comes to him and Leigh, unfortunately, things start to go wrong there as well, because while the two of them do care about each other, Christine is starting to get between them, because Christine seems to have a possessive love for Arnie. And for example, she'll stop working when the two of them are making out in the car, or she'll only play music on her radio that sort of correlates with romance and love, the stuff that was from like decades ago, like, and we're talking like songs that are only old songs, like nothing new. But Leigh, though, the breaking point for her is when she nearly chokes to death in the car one night when they're at a drive-in, and Arnie, who had gone outside to sort of try and get the windshield wipers to start working again, suddenly the car comes back on, and it freaks her out so much that she starts choking on her food. And if a random passerby hadn't happened to get the door open from the outside and take her out and give her the Heimlich maneuver, she would have choked to death in the car. And so she's trying to tell Arnie that, look, there's something wrong with this car, and you need to get rid of it. But Arnie's like, no, you're jealous, aren't you? I mean, Christine is like, you know, Christine's my pride and joy. Um, and in fact, earlier he had told Dennis that, the reason that he was so fixated on Christine when he saw her was that, for a first time, he's, got something that is even uglier than him. And this is, of course, when the car was, in its decrepit, and rusted out state when they found her initially. But now she's, looking brand new and everything, to a point where not only are, Arnie's new mannerisms, drawing attention, but so is the car. And, a couple of people that, you know, that notice are, Buddy Rapperton and his gang, who, with revenge on the mind for them, for Arnie, quote unquote, getting them expelled. One night they break into Darnell's place and totally destroy the car. And so, the next day, Arnie and Leigh, they, head to Darnell's because, Arnie had something they left in the car, but he says, hey, look, I'm just getting something from the car, then we can, sort of start anew, because they're trying to sort of work things out, right? And they definitely care about each other and they want things to work, but, but Arnie's like, okay, just, I won't focus so much on Christine, okay? But I get something from her. But unfortunately, worst possible timing for him to find his car has been totally destroyed. And, Leigh tries to comfort him, but Arnie just lashes out at her like a wild man, unhinged, and, scares her off. And, at this point, his parents, try to, step in, and because they see how devastated he is over this, the loss of his car, and, just how it's emotionally, gotten to him. And, they noticed that he was changing already, and they at least see that the car was important to him as like a symbol of independence. But, when they offer to, help him buy a new car, he just sort of, scoffs at them, saying, this is what you guys wanted all along. And after he cusses them out, he, heads upstairs to, get some shut-eye. And, his father, finally steps in and says, hey, you've been way too disrespectful to us, for too long, ever since you've had this car. Now you go back and apologize to your mother. And Arnie just sort of, gets in this grip, and nearly kills his father. But he just sort of, and then he just sort of chuckles and, and goes upstairs and he says, basically tells his father to F off, right? Which definitely rattles him. But, Arnie ends up, going back to Darnell's and, just looking over the remains of his car. And, he's heartbroken. This was his baby. But then Christine comes to life and repairs herself in front of Arnie. And once Arnie sees this, the two of them become inseparable, and they start a killing spree against all those who have wronged him, starting with Buddy Rapperton and his gang. And it's only a matter of time, before, before their attention, turns to, Leigh. And Dennis, of course, is, kind of caught in the middle because he's Arnie's friend, and he's, trying to, get through to him, saying, hey, dude, something's wrong, here. You've totally changed. And he's trying to, tell him that, look, Leigh really cares about you. But, Arnie, he's become very dismissive of her and just, basically, he's become head over heels in love with the car, with Christine. And somehow or another, Christine, she's got him under her spell. And, even when Dennis, found out about the car's previous owner, Leig's brother, and how he died in the car. He had tried to tell Arnie about it, but Arnie just blew him off. And Leigh seems to know that Christine has a life of her in mind of her own as well, because he sort of intimated that he saw the car come back on its own one night, after he had made his brother get rid of the car after his wife had committed suicide and his daughter had died in it. And so Dennis knows something's wrong with the car. Leigh knows something's wrong with the car. And the fact that the people who have wronged Arnie are being killed off, are being killed off by it. I mean, yeah, they're definitely in trouble. So, okay. So the movie, though, I mean, it's something that it definitely, could have been, just a straight up cheesy B movie, but with Carpenter at the helm, and you got a good script and you got some good actors, I mean, you have something that ends up being a lot better than it has a right to be. I mean, on one hand, the car itself, I mean, the 1958, Plymouth Fury, I mean, she ends up becoming a character all her own, and communicates by way of, say, music from decades past, and the songs sort of correlate with what's going on with the scenes at hand in terms of, say, Arnie's state of mind. And so right away there is definitely a relationship between man and machine. And you see how Christine is definitely changing Arnie, but she also communicates by way of, say, her lights. For example, when she's going after Buddy Rapperton and his gang, her eyes light up like, say, something from out of a nightmare. So it's like there's this creature from hell coming right after you. And on the other hand, when it comes to, say, the human characters, I mean, Keith Gordon does a really good job of playing Arnie. I mean, and you really buy him as a mistreated outcast in high school, and you definitely feel sorry for him, especially the fact that not only is he being bullied in high school, but he's being bullied by his parents, and the vulnerability and weakness that he displays for his character was very believable. And so when he starts to change with under Christine's influence, in some respects, at least in my case, I was kind of rooting for Arnie, because, I mean, he was starting to sort of stand up for himself, but then, he becomes, a straight up jerk. And considering, what he's had to put up with, it's understandable, but instead of just growing a backbone, he starts to become, a rather abusive individual. And Keith Gordon did a really good job in the part. And in fact, there's a scene that's not only a standout for him, but for co-star John Stockwell as well. But when Arnie and Dennis are in the car one night, they're in Christine, and this is after both Dennis and Leigh have come to the conclusion that Christine's alive, and Dennis is trying to get through to his friend one more time, and Arnie has this really potent monologue about love and the voracious appetite that it has. And he's talking about a car, mind you, but he makes it believable. And the way that he doesn't blink when he says it, I mean, it's a pretty intense scene. And both Keith Gordon and John Stockwell do really good in the scene. I mean, because John Stockwell, I mean, here he is in a car that is somewhat, it is certainly supernatural in nature, and it's bumping off people left and right that have wronged wronged Arnie. And here he is, right next to his friend, who is a completely different person, and he's helpless to get through to him. I mean, all he can do is near, come to tears, and he's literally crying at this point. He's trying, begging him, to snap out of it. But yeah, I mean, Keith Gordon does. I mean, just in general, does a really good job in the part, and he really makes you, buy, Arnie as a character, whether it be, say, as, you know, an abused, outcast, social outcast, or someone who has a backbone, finally, to someone who's a destructive, abrasive individual. And when it comes to Dennis, I thought that John Stockwell did a really good job playing his character, because this being the 80s, I mean, most of the time when you saw jocks on being portrayed on screen, a good amount of time they were straight up jerks. And well, I guess you could say it sort of goes along with the perception of them being jerks in real life in high school. And I can say from experience that, I mean, yeah, there were a lot of jerk jocks, but there are also some, decent people too. So, I mean, you know, so Dennis was a believable character in that regard, in a sense that, I mean, he had an in, with the popular crowd. I mean, girls liked him and everything, but he wasn't a douchebag. Like, he was actually a good person. He didn't let it get to his head. I mean, he spoke the lingo when it came to his fellow jocks and his friends in the football team, but, he didn't let that, keep him from, being a good friend to Arnie. And so, seeing him go from being the confident one, the one who has, some measure of strength in the situation, both physically and mentally, to being someone who, it's like the tables are turned, and Arnie's the one who's in power, and Dennis is the one who is, in danger. And because the fact that, he's having to use crutches because of his injury puts him in a physical disadvantage, but just emotionally and, mentally, I mean, he's at a disadvantage as well, because, I mean, yeah, he's sane and everything, but he's helpless to, get through to Arnie because of Christine's influence, because she's something supernatural. And so I like seeing how you get the idea that if this hadn't been a supernatural car, Dennis very well may have been able to get through and help to save his friend, but because this is a supernatural car we're talking about who's exerting her influence on Arnie, I mean, the good guy, is nearly helpless to save his friend. And so I like seeing that, sort of transformation, with Dennis's character. So you have, Keith Gordon doing a good job of having his character going from one point to another, and then you have John Stockwell doing a good job having his character, have a believable transition as well, going from being the strong one to the weak one. And John Stockwell, of course, is one of those actors that, I mean, if you watch movies from the 80s, I mean, you'll remember him from, say, the opening scene of Top Gun. That's what a lot of people remember him for. But I think this is probably his best work, though. I liked him in the Albert Pion movies, Radioactive Dreams and Dangerously Close, because he showed a lot of range in those movies. But this is probably, the movie that he's best remembered for. That or Top Gun, even though he was only in it at the beginning, but he did a good job and everything. And I just thought that he's one of those actors who, in my opinion, was someone who, should be spoken of in the same breath as, say, like Emilio Estevez, or, people who are like in The Breakfast Club and things like that. Or The Outsiders. I mean, he, in my opinion, is as good as those people, or was good as those people. And I would even argue Keith Gordon was as well. It's just that things worked out differently, to where they're not, say, spoken of in the same breath as, say, the rest of the Brat Pack, so to speak. But yeah, I mean, John Stockwell, though, I mean, he's sort of retired from acting as far as I know, and went into directing. And if I remember correctly, he directed Blue Crush or something like that, or Touristas. I haven't seen those movies, but anyway, that's that he's dabbling in directing as of late, and so more power to him. But it's a bummer that he didn't continue to act, but because he was actually a good actor, and so was Keith Gordon as well. But Keith Gordon, he too has gone on to be a director as well, and so it's neat seeing how both of those actors, I mean, definitely made their mark in '80s cinema, but they went on to a different field, albeit still within the realm of filmmaking. As far as the character of Leigh goes, the actress Alexandra Paul, she on the surface she comes across as a bit wooden, like someone who's drop dead gorgeous, but doesn't seem to have a lot of emotional range. But then you watch the movie again and you realize that the reason she doesn't seem to have a lot of range is because her character is a very shy and reserved character. Because I mean, you consider her situation. I mean, here she is, transferring to a new high school in senior year, and she's in a new environment. And I mean, yeah, she knows the schoolwork and everything because I mean, she's got the brains, and what have you. But she's in a new environment with a new set of people, and so you know her quiet mannerisms, come across as more believable considering her character situation. And then here she is, I mean, falling in love with Arnie, who, granted, has a confidence boost, courtesy of Christine, but while she genuinely cares for Arnie and loves him, I mean, she's also, terrified about being in the same, space as, his car, because there's clearly something wrong with his car. And when he starts to care more about the car than her, I mean, this is something that she's never experienced before. She's never been in this kind of situation before, obviously. So her reserved nature, I mean, it's like a coping mechanism almost. And so in that respect, I thought that, in hindsight, Alexandra Paul did a good job with her character. And I also do like her budding friendship, or I should say, yeah, her developing friendship with Dennis, because while she does have good chemistry with Keith Gordon as Arnie, she also has good chemistry with John Stockwell as Dennis, because, I mean, in other movies, you would have it happen to where, say, his character being a jock, would be the one to get the girl in the end. But it doesn't quite work out like that. But they do clearly start to care about each other in a sense that, both of them are affected by, the situation with Arnie, being changed by Christine, and the fact that there's literally a supernatural car in the picture. And so it's like they're two people who care for their, for Arnie, and are trying to, find out what's going on. And you see the two of them like talking about what they've learned about Christine, and also just how they've both been hurt by how they've had to watch someone that they've cared about change into a completely different person, into a monster almost, or at least a harsher individual because of the car. And both of them have come to accept the fact that, there is something supernatural about Christine. But of course, them trying to tell, grown adults about it, doesn't seem to be an option that they don't, think is going to work out so well. So, they kind of keep it, to themselves and try and figure out, a way to, fight back against Christine, which they end up doing in a rather memorable climax of the film. And it's one of those moments where it's like, in a lesser director's hands, the climax of Christine, versus the two of them, and what they end up using to fight Christine, would have been something stupid. But in John Carpenter's hands, you get something that's genuinely memorable, and it's man versus machine in a way that I don't want to spoil, but works rather well. And you could argue that because of what's being used to fight Christine, there's some commentary on the nature of machines, and one machine being old and the other being new, that kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, so yeah, you do have like a set of characters that you really come to care about, in a story that it's far-fetched. I mean, having a killer car that has a mind of its own, but yet they pull it off, though. I mean, they have it to where we have characters that we care about, and we also come to see Christine as a character all her own. And there are times where we root for Christine when she goes after the people that made Arnie's life hell. But when we see how she's pushing him to lash out at those who care about him, that's when we know it's like, okay, yes, we're rooting for Christine in these moments, but she's a danger, she's a threat, and she needs to be stopped, that kind of thing. And so it's like, I'm not gonna say you love to hate Christine, because it's hard to hate Christine, but she's a villain you kind of root for in certain circumstances while recognizing her nature as a threat. So John Carpenter and his people, they definitely pulled off an unlikely miracle here by having a killer car movie where the car is a believable character in and of itself, or herself, along with a set of characters that we care about. And even and there's a set of character actors that show up, like Robert Prosky, the guy who is Daniel's boss in Mrs. Doubtfire, the guy who is um, getting he's talking with Daniel about Robin Williams about a new job, or a new way to spruce up entertainment on the kids show and what have you. That guy, Scallywag and all that stuff. If you've seen Mrs. Doubtfire, you probably know what I'm talking about. But yeah, Robert Prosky was just a great character actor, and so I first saw him in Mrs. Doubtfire. So seeing him going from a jovial, jolly old man, who is taking the liberty of ordering scotch for Robin Williams. I mean, going from that to him being a complete douchebag of a cigar chomping old man, in this movie. In fact, it's like he actually looks older in this movie than he does in Mrs. Doubtfire. So go figure. But I mean, it definitely showed his range as an actor. Because he showed that he could be straight up unlikable. And it's a believable performance, though, because I've actually met people who are just that spiteful just because they can be. It's like they see someone that is reserved or nervous, and they just hone in on it and just lash out at them. It's like anything that's going wrong in their lives, they take it on that person. And so him seeing Arnie as that kind of person, he just hones in on Arnie, just lashes out at him, and kind of makes Arnie's time difficult at the garage, or at least you get the idea that he is. But like, even when he tries to be nice to Arnie, he can't keep it up and goes right back to being a douchebag. But you also have Harry Dean Stanton, the late Harry Dean Stanton, show up as a detective named Junkins, who's investigating the killings of Buddy Rapperton and his gang. And Harry Dean Stanton is it's Harry Dean Stanton. He's a good actor, good character actor, and been in a lot of movies over the years. Of course, I remember him from Alien and Pretty in Pink, Repo Man, and most recently I saw him in Twin Peaks, The Return. So I mean, but yes, it's sad that he's no longer with us, but it's always good to see him in a movie, and even if it's in a minor part as a detective who shows up now and again. I mean, he's believable. He has a sort of world weariness to him that a detective would probably have, in considering his profession. And so whenever he's interacting with Arnie, I mean, he sort of has this Columbo type of thing going, and you get the idea that he starts to figure out that something's wrong with the car as well. Because at first he's thinking this is just Arnie going on a kill spree, but then he the way he starts to the way he starts to interact with Arnie, later on, you kind of get the idea that he's starting to pick up on the fact that there's something wrong with the car. And I just thought that Harry Dean Stanton did a good job of playing that. Even though he didn't have a huge part, I mean, he still did a good job with what he had. And also, Robert Blossom played the old man, Leigh, who sold Arnie the car in the first place. I know I've seen him in something before, but I can't remember what. But he was a good character actor, and he did a good job of playing this semi creepy old man who at times he could be really friendly, and at times he could be very creepy. And so in the scene when Dennis confronts him about selling Arnie a car that the guy's brother died in, and Leigh tells him the story. It's a pretty good scene because on one hand, I mean, you have John Stockwell doing a good job of basically just non-verbally asking what happened next, just facial expression, and then for the most part, and then Robert Blossom, does a good job as Leigh, telling him the story of how his brother died and how his brother and his brother's family died, in the car, and so and of course you have that memorable moment when he says he made his brother get rid of the car. He said, "Of course, she came back 2 weeks later," and Dennis is like, "What do you mean came back?" And Leigh just looks at him, and it's that look that says, "You know damn well what I'm talking about." So I like seeing that, and I mean that shows up with more than one character in a sense that they can't really explain it, but they know something's wrong with that car, and there's something evil about it, that kind of thing. But yeah, and Kelly Preston shows up too as a cheerleader named Roseanne, who is clearly attracted to Dennis, and I mean he seems to kind of like her too, but he ends up, of course, becoming kind of smitten with Leigh, as is Arnie, as well. But I mean, seeing Kelly Preston, pop up in an early role was rather interesting to see. But as far as acting goes, I liked Christine Belford as Regina, Arnie's mother, because she really did a good job of playing, someone who was domineering and, basically unnecessarily, mean to Arnie. And, I've met people like that, who like they were rude. They were rude people, but like they were rude to family and just sort of controlled things. And I thought that she did a good job of making you not like her. And it was one of those moments where it's like when Arnie's lashing out at him. I mean, it's alarming because of what's happening to him and how he's changing. But on the other hand, though, this woman is someone that definitely deserves to have someone call her out on her behavior. But yeah, so I really like the music in the film. I mean, John Carpenter, I mean, he turns in another wonderful score, and it's something that you hear it, you don't forget it, and especially in the scenes where Arnie's having a moment with his car, like when he first meets her, or when he's sort of mourning her, when she's seemingly been destroyed, or when Christine's, getting her revenge on Buddy. I mean, the music, works well in, with, what's going on, in the scenes at hand. And as far as special effects go, there are some good ones. I mean, it's not like a special effects, heavy movie, but there are some good special effects in it, though. I mean, like when Christine repairs herself, that's an amazing, special effects set piece. And basically they used like an inflatable model as well as reverse photography, and it's wonderful to see. And this is 1983. And then, of course, in the scene when, Christine's, chasing down, Buddy and his gang, I mean, like there's a moment when Christine ends up, catching on fire, and she looks like a demon straight from out of hell, and the music, it goes along with it is awesome, But yeah, I mean, overall though, I mean, this was a good movie. I will say though that there are some things that keep it from, I guess, that sort of remind you that yeah, you're watching a killer car movie, and the B movie nature, and the B movie that it could have been in a lesser director's hands, sort of comes out from time to time. I mean, thankfully, John Carpenter at the helm keeps it from staying that cheesy B movie it could have been, and mostly keeps it as a good movie. But there are some aspects that are kind of like, okay, really, such as the fact that this is supposed to be high school, but everyone there is clearly 20 or 30 years old, especially Buddy Rapperton and his gang. I mean, you look at them and they're like, how many times were you guys held back? That kind of thing. And of course, Buddy and his gang, they just exist to be, complete douchebags, and, to be unlikable for a purpose of, say, serving as targets for Christine's rage. And yeah, we definitely root for their passing and everything, but at the same time, they kind of just feel like, there are moments where they feel like real bullies, but other times they feel like cartoonish bullies. And so, like something you'd see on a stage play or something like that. Like maybe the guy who played Buddy was trying too hard. But then there are moments where he actually does a good job, like when he pulls out the switchblade. And Buddy was played by William Ostrander. So, but anyway, though, so as Buddy Rapperton, William Ostrander was hit or miss. But I think, maybe if I understand it was prevalent in the 80s to have, 20 or 30 something year olds playing high school students. So Christine isn't necessarily unique in that regard. But I do think that they probably would have been able to sell certain aspects of, the plot as far as, high school drama and teenage angst goes if we'd actually had teenagers playing teenagers, if that makes sense. I mean, to be fair, Keith Gordon and John Stockwell do a good job playing teenagers, but, everyone else, though, you look at them and you're like, what are you doing still in high school? So, and also one other thing is the fact that a lot of the people, they tend to automatically, buy into the fact that Christine is supernatural, just almost instantaneously. And that sort of leads into, another issue that the movie has, is that the transition of time is a bit jarring in some scenes. And it'll be like time has clearly passed, but it goes from, say, it feels like it's going from point A to point C, but they skipped B altogether. So basically, yeah, it just, there are moments where it's like, for example, when Arnie's character transition's happening, it feels rushed at times because of how the transitions of time are handled. And, but on the other hand, it feels like because of that, or moments like that, it's like Arnie gets a car and people are automatically thinking that there's something wrong with this car, and there's not really a sense of suspense that is teased. I mean, there's some suspense in the sense that whenever the car's going after someone, but in a sense of, say, okay, is this thing really supernatural, or is this just like, something a target of obsession for Arnie, and he's just really forming an attachment to this? If they had played it more like that, I feel like the eventual revelation that Christine is definitely supernatural would have had a lot more impact than it did. I mean, it still has an impact when you see Christine visibly repairing herself and all that. But just, I feel like if they had, sort of, teased it out a little longer, and had people like gradually come to see, or at least entertain the notion that Christine is evil, instead of just, believing that it's evil right off the bat, I feel like, the suspense, would have been better. But other than that, though, other than those things, I mean, like, while they keep the movie from being great and they sort of bring the movie down to being a B movie at times, the other factors, like John Carpenter at the helm, good screenplay, the main actors doing a good job, and just, of course, elevates the movie to where, I mean, yes, this could have been a cheesy B movie, but while it has moments that fall into that territory, it's actually elevated to a good movie. So I'm going to go ahead and give Christine, 4 out of 5 stars. This was a good movie, and arguably the best, killer car movie that you'll come across. So as far as bonus features go, or special features, you have a really good commentary track with director John Carpenter and star Keith Gordon, and it's really interesting to listen to them talking about the movie, from 2004, and of course, listening to it in 2025 is kind of a mind-boggling experience, just because of different times and everything. But seeing, watching the movie and listening to the two of them talk about it, they have a lot of good things to say, a lot of good stories to tell, and they have a good chemistry. So it's a good conversational audio commentary. It's never boring, and there's some funny moments as well. But you learn a lot about the movie. And one of the things I was kind of disappointed to learn was that while on screen, Keith Gordon and John Stockwell do a good job playing their characters as best friends, and they have really good chemistry with one another. You find out that, I mean, behind the scenes, I mean, they really weren't friends. I mean, they didn't hate each other or anything, but it's just, for them, it was just a job. They didn't really become friends behind the scenes or anything like that, which is kind of a bummer. But I guess in a way, it kind of shows how good of actors that they were, because they were able to sell the fact that their characters were best friends. So there you go. But you also have, 20 deleted and alternate scenes. And while there's nothing, say, mind-blowing or like, whoa, that's awesome, or something like that, or game-changing, there are some interesting, bits that come up here and there. Like, there's a deleted bit where when Dennis and Leigh are talking about how much Arnie is, changed, and how the car seems to be exerting a malevolent influence on him, like he's pointing out how Arnie's handwriting has started to change. And like when he signed Dennis's cast at one point, and then he signed it again, it was like different handwriting entirely. So like he's literally becoming a different person. And that's something that sort of ties into, the novel's take on things, because, but anyway, though, I'll get into that in a sec. But you have interesting bits like that, but for the most part, there's just like slightly extended scenes of what's already in the movie, but nothing that adds a whole lot to what's already there. But I do kind of wish that they had kept that bit about Arnie's handwriting in, because that would have made things a little interesting. But you also have 3 featurettes about the making of the movie, and they are Christine, Fast and Furious, and this is where we talk a lot. They talk a lot about, with the actors and the people behind the scenes and how the movie was made, and it's a rather informative documentary. And a lot of the information was already covered in the commentary track by Carpenter and Gordon, but it's still a good making of featurette. And you also have Christine, Finish Line, which talks about the film's score, and also about audience and critical reaction, both at the time and over the years. And that's rather interesting, how the perception of the film has changed over the years and how they go into that, and also how the score was made, and how it's kind of become one of John Carpenter's most recognizable scores. And last but not least, you have Christine, Ignition, which it's not a bad featurette, because there's a lot of pre-production material that they talk about, like what they were going to do versus what ended up actually happening and how things came to be. But usually you would think something like that would be the first featurette. And so while these are all good featurettes, I do think that the order should have been different. Like Christine, Ignition should have been before Christine, Fast and Furious. But you kind of, one of the things you find out in watching these featurettes, though, is that the movie was going to be more like the book, in the sense that, spoiler, it turns out that the guy who sold Arnie, the car in the book, was Levy's brother. So the guy who sold Arnie in the car in the movie was sort of an amalgamation of, both, the guy who killed himself in Christine, and also, the guy's brother, who, ended up, telling, Dennis, what happened. But in the book, though, the guy, almost as soon as he sold the car to Arnie, he ended up killing himself, and his ghost basically haunted the car and haunted Arnie as well. And there are points where Arnie is actually talking to the ghost, and the ghost is becoming more, decayed looking, and what as a revenant and everything. And so Arnie starts to physically, transform into the guy almost, to the point where it's like, the guy had a back brace and everything, and Arnie, basically works himself to the bone so much that he ends up getting a back brace, things like that. And so they were talking about how they were going to have it more like the book in that regard, how to where, it was more so, the guy's ghost was haunting Arnie, and in turn, giving the car a more focused, sense of evil, because in the book you get the idea that the car was already supernatural, but it was more like a savage primal beast. But with Leigh, with the guy haunting the car, it became something actively malevolent instead of just, say, a wild animal, so they said that they were going to do it like that, but some of the special effects that they were going to go with, they felt like were too reminiscent of, say, something like An American Werewolf in London, with where you see like ghosts who are spirits of murdered people who are gradually decaying as the film goes on, and they felt like the special effects would be too similar to that, and they were going to be accused of ripping off Rick Baker's work in American Wolf in London, and so they decided, okay, let's not do that. Let's just have it to where the car itself is evil right off the bat. And so in some ways I thought that actually worked better than the novel, made it a little less complicated. But in some respects, I wish that they had kept, the element of, the dead brother in there, because it certainly added an extra layer of evil to the thing, to the horror. But yeah, so all in all, it's a good movie and a good DVD. So if this is your first time, potentially checking out Christine, this is a good way to go. And if you're already a fan of Christine, it's definitely worth picking up because it's got a good set of bonus features. So, and plus, it's a good John Carpenter movie. So that was Christine, 4 out of 5 stars. This was a good one. So thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. And you got any questions, comments, please drop a line and let me know. And if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. So y'all take care. Have a good day. Bye.